Welcome everyone to another DLS seminar. It is my pleasure to introduce Nicolás Pérez from Weber State, our northern neighbor. I met Nicolás almost 2 years ago at the third early career workshop. Told me that he was going to be our neighbor. Like, oh, we have to bring you for a seminar. And like a year and a half later, we finally made it. So Nicolás went to get his bachelor's in British Columbia at the University of Los before moving to the East Coast of the United States at Syracuse University and moved for a couple of years to MIT as a postdoctoral fellow. Has been at Weber State since summer 2023. He's a geomorphologist. Today he's gonna talk about erosion and mountain formation. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Juan Carlos and Chad, for putting your time to organize and invite me. And I'm excited to be here and finally being at the University of Utah. It's nice to meet colleagues, talk about research and teaching experiences that we are sharing during these times. So thank you so much for putting time to meet me and to come here to my talk. Today I'm gonna be talking about erosion rates, orogen, ages, and erodibility. And maybe if you looked at the poster that was outside in the hallways, you saw the word ontogenies of orogenies. And I use that word ontogeny, which is mostly used in paleontology or biology, and refers to the changes that occur in an organism through its lifetime. So how, for example, would you go as a human from being a fetus and change into an old person, all the changes that occur in your morphology. And similarly, what I'm gonna try to show today is that throughout the history of mountain range, there are things that change. The amount of fractures, the types of rocks that are exposed on the surface of the mountain ranges are different, and that affects the erosion rates, the rates at which the landscape surface is being lowered. So that's what I'm gonna try to convince you or show you that I have the data to support. So why study erosion rates, or why are we interested in erosion rates? Why listen to a talk on erosion rates? Because they affect us as humans. This is a picture from Big Sur, from Highway 1 in the coast of California, the western coast of the United States. And you're seeing a pretty big landslide that disrupted this highway. So erosion processes like landslides affect us as humans. They destroy our infrastructure. They affect our daily routines. This is a similar event, mass wasting process in a highway in Colombia, a highway that connects the capital, Bogota, to the lowlands in the Amazon basin. And this is where a lot of the oil exploration occurs. And so it's a pretty important highway that gets blocked by erosion processes and mass wasting processes every year. So part of my research has been trying to study why do we get high erosion rates in some parts of the mountain ranges like this one. Here's another image of another erosion event, mass wasting process, also in the southern part of Colombia. This is a debris avalanche that killed 300 people in a matter of minutes. It occurred at about 4 a.m. On 2017, after a period of high rainfalls, and you can see the impact that it had, like basically buried whole neighborhoods and destroyed part of a city. Erosion also creates some of the most wonderful landscapes that we get to see, and that's part of why I am here in Utah right now. I was always excited about the American West and studying the mountains here. This is a picture from Grand Canyon, which was formed due to fluvial erosion of rivers. Here's another picture of a canyon in southern Colombia formed over horizontally lying volcanic rocks. When I talk about erosion, I mean the removal of solid material from the Earth's surface by physical and chemical processes. And we usually measure that in units of length over time. So it can be meters per year or meters per million years. So we're measuring that longitudinal units over time. And I'm going to talk a lot about erosion rates. I'm talking about that, how fast material is getting removed from the surface and being put into river systems that then carry it away into a sedimentary basin. Geoscientists like me, geomorphologists, we try to create maps of erosion rates, and then we talk to structural geologists or other geoscientists. And the idea is that we want to understand erosion rates spatially. Why is it that this mountain range or this area of the United States has higher erosion rates than this other part? And then we can come and explain it because maybe we have more faults here, or this is a tectonically active region and this is not, or the rock uplift rates here are higher than in these other areas. So we try to create maps of erosion like this one here. And for that, I'm going to show you data today of a technique called cosmogenic nuclides. And basically, we go to smaller river catchments in mountain ranges and collect a sample of sand of that catchment and estimate an erosion rate average for that catchment, that polygon, that small polygon. And then we got that data of erosion rates, and we can combine it with other information of the topography of those mountain ranges. For example, how steep those landscapes are, how steep that basin or catchment is, how much precipitation there is, what's the type of rock that is exposed in that catchment. And we create relationship between those variables like erosion and then those topographic or climate variables. We make correlations and we can extrapolate that data of a few data points to a whole landscape. And then that's a pretty cool map that then a structural geologist can help us understand why we're having such patterns there. Another interesting reason of why I like studying erosion is because I think we're finally at a stage where we are creating these larger spatially and temporal models of landscape evolution, where we are able to reproduce the topography of our planet and then maybe let it run for several million years and see what's happening with erosion in different parts. So this is a figure from a study by Sales in 2023, where they ran the evolution of the Earth through the last 100 millions of years. So we kind of know how the mountains have been uplifted over the last 100 million years. And we can run a model that solves an equation of erosion for each pixel on that model to track where sediment is being produced and where it is going in those 100 million years. And then see what happens with the sedimentary basins. What happens when we have uplifting of mountains or when we change the climate? How is erosion affected by those processes? And why I think that this talk is important in those models is because I'm going to argue that we cannot use the same parameters over the lifespan of a mountain range. So if we're saying if we're uplifting a mountain range, I'm going to show you that the amount of fractures and the rock types exposed in that mountain range affect the total erosion that is being produced at a certain point in time. It is a well-known and intuitive idea that tectonic rock uplift or tectonics drives deformation, which can thicken the crust. And this drives the uplift of mountain ranges. And in general, areas that have high tectonic activity or high rock uplift rates have higher erosion. And this is because when rocks get uplifted and form mountain ranges, these landscapes become steeper. In contrast, an area that hasn't been deformed or hasn't been uplifted is not as steep. So usually we think of tectonically active areas as having high erosion rates. So if you compare two schematic mountain ranges, one with high uplift rates and the other one with low uplift rates, you're gonna see that the place with higher uplift rates leads to steeper landscapes, and those landscapes are easier to erode. And this is because if you remember that basic physics problems that we have, where we have a ramp and a block, as you change that angle, the steepness of the landscape or the steepness of that ramp, you're changing the downslope component of the weight and making it easier to move material. So if I give you a hose and I give you a pile of sand and ask you to wash that, that material away, it's gonna be easier if I give you a steeper ramp than the flatter ramp. So that's kind of a very intuitive explanation of why erosion is faster in steeper landscapes. The way in which we see that relationship when we have data is that we go to those landscapes. We can go to different landscapes with different steepness values. So maybe some steep landscapes and some shallow landscapes. And we can collect data on erosion rates, and then we can look at it in our computers and then plot erosion rate along the y-axis, and then the steepness, some sort of metric of steepness, the average steepness for the rivers in that catchment or the average steepness for those mountains. And we usually find a positive relationship where steeper landscapes give higher values of erosion rates. However, there have been studies in the past 20 years that have said, wait a second, if you plot, for example, this paper by Molnar in 2007 said, like, actually, if you look at data on erosion rate on the y-axis and basin steepness on the x-axis for different mountain ranges, things don't work quite as easy as we were seeing. There are steep landscapes such as the mountains in Sri Lanka, which are these orange values here. So you can see that if I go to the steeper parts of Sri Lanka, their erosion rate is much lower than if I go to the same steepness values in catchments in the Himalaya. So steepness is maybe not the best predictor for erosion in this case. And why is that? Why is it that at the same value of steepness, you have such variation in erosion rates? Here are some of those landscapes. For example, these are super steep cliffs in places like the Amazon basin in South America. This is called the Guyana Shield in Venezuela and Brazil. And you have these very steep cliffs. So you would be in like the higher steepness values, but your erosion rates in places like these are quite low. So they are kind of defying the expectations that we have. These places, again, super steep, but with low erosion rates. These are the mountains in Sri Lanka. They're pretty steep, similarly as steep as places in Utah or other landscapes that are eroding much faster. So what is going on here? Why are these steep landscapes eroding much slower than expected? If you look at a simple erosion equation that we use in geomorphology, you can see that there are other factors apart from steepness of the landscape that also control the erosion. So if you look at a simple erosion equation, you have a parameter that has the steepness or the slope of the landscape, but you also have to take into account things like the precipitation or discharge, and this parameter K, which is the erodibility of the landscape. And that has to do with the rocks exposed at the surface. How easy is it to erode those rocks. What Molnar proposed in this 2007 paper was that erodibility actually may be the most important factor in controlling erosion. So not only slope, but also erodibility. And the idea that they said was, in places like the Himalaya, the rocks are being deformed as they are being tectonically deformed, they're being crushed, they're being fractured. So when they come to the surface, those rocks in the Himalaya are much weaker than in other places that are not being deformed. So places like the Himalaya will erode much more easily than places in Sri Lanka, just because the rocks exposed at the surface will be more fractured. So if you think about this diagram here, maybe the idea of why these rocks or why these catchments here have much higher erosion rates for the same value of steepness is maybe because the rocks here are much weaker than those in Sri Lanka. And you can think of the same experiment now where I give you the pile of sand and a hose, but I give you large blocks of rocks or just a giant block of rock versus if I give you highly fractured or fine-grained material. It would be much easier with the same amount of water, the same slope, to move this material than to move this material down here. So maybe because these rocks, again, have gone through that rock crusher, they have been deformed more recently in the Himalaya, which is a tectonically active mountain range, that makes them erode much faster at the same rate. This was kind of a cool idea, cool paper that came out. And over the past decades, there have been people that have kind of proved this idea at a small scale. So this paper compares two areas in the western part of the US, in California, two mountain ranges that have similar age of formation, but they have different fracture densities. So we have the San Gabriel and northern San Jacinto Mountains. And here you have a schematic showing that the San Gabriel Mountains have a much higher fracture density. The rocks are crushed. Whereas here you have rocks with less fracture density. They are more like big blocks or chunks of rock. So the idea would be that if you compare catchments with the same slope, the same steepness, this one with higher fracture density should have a higher erosion rate because its erodibility is higher. And here's the data from that paper. Again, we're plotting erosion rate on the y-axis and steepness, so how steep those catchments are, on the x-axis. And you can see that the San Gabriel Mountains, the blue dots, plot above the northern San Jacinto Mountains. And this means that for the same basin gradient, if I take this blue line, you need, for the same basin gradient, the San Gabriel Mountains are eroding faster, slightly faster than the San Jacinto Mountains. So it's kind of what we were expecting. Or the other way to look at it is if you take two catchments that are eroding at the same rate, so you know you have measured the erosion rate and they have the same rate, the San Gabriel Mountains will be less steep than the mountains in the San Jacinto Mountains. So the landscapes in the San Jacinto need to be steeper to erode at the same rate compared to the other ones. And this is kind of an interesting idea. The equilibrium steepness for catchments to erode at the same rate is different if you have a different set of fracture densities. The erodibility of the rocks is different, and this is affecting erosion rates. Again, this is for two mountain ranges that are relatively close to each other in the same tectonic regime on the western part of the US. And after seeing this type of work, we started thinking about whether we could see similar results if we look at the evolution of the same mountain range through time. So instead of comparing two places with different fracture densities, what happens over the lifespan of one single mountain range? So are there changes in erodibility? So how easily a mountain range erodes as it goes from being tectonically active to tectonically inactive? And the idea is that when you're in a tectonically active mountain ranges, you have this active rock crusher, you're pulverizing your rocks, you're fracturing it. And if you are in the inactive orogen, you don't have this rock crusher. When you transition from being in a tectonically active orogen that is actively getting thicker and where mountains are getting built, if you suddenly shut off the tectonic switch, you don't have tectonic activity anymore, you will still have some uplift and erosion over time. So for example, places like the Appalachian Mountains are still uplifting and eroding, even though they're tectonically inactive, because you have isostatic uplift. So you're eroding the mountains, and you're having a little bit of isostatic uplift. But the idea that we had here is that over time, you are gonna be eroding through a crustal section, and you're gonna be changing the rock types that you're gonna be eroding. So when you go from the tectonically active mountain range to the tectonically inactive mountain range, over time, at first, you're gonna be eroding the upper crustal rocks that are highly fractured. And as you consume that upper crust, you're gonna expose rocks that should have less fractures and should be harder over time. So this is our hypothesis. If we somehow can track an orogen through time, the rocks that we're gonna be eroding over time are gonna be different. When the orogen is tectonically active, the rocks are pretty fractured. But if we turn off the tectonic switch and we just erode through those rocks, we're slowly going to be exposing harder and harder rocks. So the same way as this work by Neely et al. Showed changes spatially in erodibility across two mountain ranges with different fracture densities, maybe we can observe the same thing over the lifespan of an orogen. So instead of comparing geographically two areas, an old orogen, if we were to plot the data of steepness, of catchments, and erosion rate, should maybe give us this type of pattern. So for the same value of steepness, the older orogen would be eroding much slower than the younger orogen. And this is because the rocks exposed on the older orogen would be harder to erode. So given these expectations, can we find erodibility changes with the age of orogens? And to answer this question, we looked at data from the United States. And the reason is that this is a great location because we have origins of different ages in the United States. So this is a map of geological provinces created by Fenneman and the United States Geological Survey. And we have in the US also a geographic difference of older origins on the eastern side and younger origins on the western side. So maybe based on that, we can compare data from different catchments across the United States and see if we find any patterns or differences. So we compiled a data set of published erosion rates from the United States. And these are data from cosmogenic nucleates. So each of these points that you can see here is one sample from one river catchment. And most of the data comes from the eastern part of the US and the western part, with very little data in the middle. And the reason is that samples come from where we have erosion rates. We have a bias in sampling because scientists usually look for places with high erosion rates, which are in mountain ranges. So we don't have a lot going on where we expect low erosion rates kind of in the middle of the continent. So how do these cosmogenic nuclide works, or what is that data? Some of you might be familiar with this technique, but I'm going to briefly explain how it works. So basically, we are sampling sand from river catchments. So we go to a river and we collect a little bit of sand from the channel. And the idea is that that sand came from erosion of rocks and soils within the catchment, so upstream of the catchment. And that sand is a good sample that has been well mixed from all over the catchment upstream. And what is happening in the soil upstream of that catchment? The surface of the earth is constantly being bombarded by cosmic particles. Those cosmic particles interact with atoms in the atmosphere and on the surface of the earth. And those interactions produce or create new atoms or isotopes that we call cosmogenic nuclides. So a surface or rock that has been exposed to those to interaction with cosmogenic nuclides with cosmogenic rays for a long time will have a higher concentration of cosmogenic nuclides. So they serve to date things. If you have a soil that has been stable and exposed to cosmic rays for a long period of time, it will accumulate a lot of these cosmogenic nuclides that are being produced within minerals in that soil. So if you grab a sample of soil from a very old soil and you measure the amount of cosmogenic nuclides, you will get a higher concentration compared to a young soil that hasn't been exposed for a long period of time. This is the same principle that we're using when we sample that river sand and we measure the concentration of cosmogenic nuclides. And based on the amount, we can estimate an erosion rate. The idea is that the amount that we measure downstream will be proportional to the amount that we have in these soils. And you can think of, if you have high erosion rates, so if you are removing soil really fast, you are going to have pretty young soils in your catchments. So your concentration of cosmogenic nuclides is going to be low in your soils and in your river sample. If your landscape is pretty stable, like that landscape in South America that I showed you that has low erosion rates, your soils are going to accumulate a lot of cosmogenic nuclides, and the soils that get washed into the river are going to have high cosmogenic nuclide concentrations. So the concentrations in the river sands tell us about the processes that occur in the upstream catchment. And that's basically what we are getting at here. We're getting a number that tells us how fast erosion occurs upstream in that catchment. If you are interested in more details, I can provide more references on these techniques. So let's look at some of the hypotheses that we would expect from the data that we are compiling. Again, I'm going to be showing you erosion rate on the y-axis and the steepness of the landscape on the x-axis. If we have changes in the erodibility, or what is controlling the erosion when we go from, for example, the Appalachians or an old orogen to a young active orogen. For example, here I'm putting some dummy data on comparing the Pacific, Rocky Mountains, and Appalachians. This is synthetic data. If the slope is what mainly controls the erosion rates, we would expect that when we plot data from these different orogens that have different ages, older in the Appalachians and younger in the Pacific coast, we would expect all the data to plot along a single line, one single regression for all the data. As you get steeper, your erosion rate is higher, kind of similar to that example with the hose and the steepness of the ramp. However, if over time, apart from changing the steepness, you are also changing the amount of fractures, and you're going from a young, highly fractured orogen to an older, harder orogen, you would not only expect to find that relationship with slope, but you would also expect to find different vertical differences among the different orogens. So again, for the same value of basin steepness, the weaker orogen full of fractures because it's young and tectonically active will have a higher erosion rate than the old, not fractured orogen. Here is a comparison of the two hypotheses, whether everything is controlled by slope or whether apart from slope, we have these vertical differences caused by how weak the rocks at the surface are. So let's look at our results. Again, I'm going to show you erosion rates versus the steepness of these landscapes. And this is the data for different orogens in the US. In general, for every orogen, you find some relationship, some positive relationship between how steep the catchments are and how much erosion is occurring in those catchments. There is also some scatter within each province, but in general, you find this positive relationship. But if we put them all together in a single graph, you can see that there is some vertical separation for these different orogens. The Appalachian highlands were an orogen active during the Paleozoic in general, and the Pacific border and basin and range have been active and uplifting over the past 10 million years. So they are pretty active and young, whereas the Appalachian we think of as an older orogen. If we just look at the regression, the regression of this data, we find that, again, that vertical separation that we're seeing. For the same value of basin steepness, so if you go to two catchments that look exactly the same, it's as hard to hike each of them as the other one. The one in the Pacific mountain ranges are eroding much faster than in the Appalachians. And if we keep on adding the rest of the orogens from the US, we find a similar trend. You can see that Western mountain ranges tend to plot higher on this graph. The data tends to be higher, and the older Appalachian data tends to plot lower. So how do we explain this data? Again, our one of the hypotheses was that maybe the data is mostly controlled by how steep these landscapes are, because some are tectonically inactive and some are tectonically active. So the western mountain ranges are steep, high, and tectonically active, and the other ones are not so steep because they are tectonically inactive. But this would result in a data set that looks more like this, where everything would be controlled by the steepness due to tectonic activity. But instead, we see something that looks more like this, like, yes, there is some relationship with the steepness, but there is this vertical separation that is being controlled by something else. Now, you would think that just having the basin steepness can tell you which catchment is going to be steeper, and this data set is saying no. Like, for the same steepness, you can have a lot of variation in that erosion rate, and that has important implications, because in a lot of classes you may have seen that steepness has a pretty big control on erosion rate, and that is true, but we need another factor to explain that variability. Here's another plot where I'm taking the average steepness, this is in log values, of the whole data set, and then I'm intersecting each of these regressions with that average steepness. So I'm calculating what the erosion rate is for each of these provinces or origins at the average basin steepness. So for a given steepness, tell me one value of steepness, what is the erosion rate for each of these origins. So here I'm plotting that erosion rate for that average steepness with the median age of orogenesis, so how old that orogen is. And you can see from this graph that the older orogens here on the left have a lower erosion rate, and the younger orogens have a higher erosion rate at that given value of steepness. So two catchments that look the same in the Pacific mountain ranges and the Appalachian Mountains. The Pacific range erodes much faster than the Appalachians, and this is also the younger mountain range. Another way to look at it is to get a given erosion rate. So if you want to create, if you want to have a catchment eroding at a given value, let's say 100 meters per million year, how steep do you need your mountains to be? And interestingly, the Appalachian Mountains need to be a lot steeper to erode at the same rate compared to the Pacific mountain ranges. And they also are the older mountain ranges. So if everywhere on the Earth was eroding at the same rate, the older mountains would need to be higher and steeper than the younger mountains. And what is driving this variation in erodibility? Why are the mountains why are the Appalachian Mountains harder to erode? Why do they need to become steeper to do the same amount of work that the mountains in the Pacific mountain ranges? The idea that we have, or that we're working with, is that it might be controlled by the amount of rock fractures, how interconnected these fractures are. And again, we're basing this idea on this Molnar et al. Paper that says that tectonically active regions are highly fractured, are still being fractured, and the fractures keep being interconnected, and tectonically dead areas don't have this active rock crusher anymore. Some of those fractures that you created will start getting eroded over time, and you will expose older rocks over time in these older orogens. Or if you're not eroding that much, maybe some of those fractures can get healed over time, and then they result in stronger rocks in old orogens. So bringing back again to this diagram, the Pacific or Western mountain ranges look more like this, where you are eroding over this highly fractured upper part of the crust, and the Appalachian Mountains in some areas have either less fractured rocks, healed fractures, or they have exposed harder rocks that were never crushed due to the rock crusher, and therefore are stronger. Here's an analog to what I'm trying to say, and this was one of my co-authors. I didn't live through this the time of these stories, but the idea was that you would get a box with one of these hard figures covered by plaster, and the plaster is more erodible than the internal core of the toy. So you can take a chisel and a hammer and play to be Michelangelo and expose the hard core of the toy, which is similar to what we think is happening with the mountain ranges. At first, the young orogens have that weak layer covering them that is highly fractured because they have gone to that tectonic rock crusher. And as you get older, your regression becomes this one, which is a stronger rock that for the same steepness won't generate as much erosion. So you're basically exposing harder or healed rocks. And what are the implications of this study? Why do I think this is relevant or interesting? So one is that I think that if we go back to these models that people are creating where they plug in an erosion, that erosion equation, we cannot use a constant of erodibility over time, but we might have to integrate the fracturing of rocks over the lifespan of the orogens to be able to actually reproduce the actual erosion rates, or to be able to actually know how high mountains were in the past. So maybe we have to have time varying parameters in some of those equations. But maybe I think the interesting part for me is that maybe this idea can contribute to helping explain why we still have such high topography in some of these tectonically active landscapes. So similar to the landscapes that I showed you at the beginning in the Guyana Shield in South America, or the mountains in Sri Lanka that have been tectonically dead for a long time. Sri Lanka has been dead for hundreds of millions of years, some of these mountains, and they still have these steep mountain ranges. And why is that? With this data that I show you, maybe you can say that because they have such hard rocks, because they are old orogens, they have hard rocks, even to erode at a low rate, they need to be pretty steep. So they need to sustain those high slopes, even if they're eroding much faster, even if they're eroding much slower than active orogens. The ramp has to be pretty steep to move even a small amount of sand through those rivers. And maybe this is also a contributing factor to explain why we still have high topography in places like the Appalachian orogeny and in other tectonically active mountain ranges. So I will leave you with this slide. So old orogenies, like the Appalachians, like Sri Lanka, have low erosion rates. We know because we have measured them, but they need to have high steepness and relief, higher steepness and relief than expected by those low erosion rates. And I just want to thank some of my collaborators and co-authors of this work. And thank you very much for your attention.
Question for Nicolás. Very cool model. Yes, second order, third order.
Yeah, could you yeah, I guess could you develop a little bit more your idea? What do you mean? Like, let's say
Like tropical soil covered in lower than
okay.
Similar.
So the effect that vegetation, roots, thick soils can even do and more like increase that factor of reducing the erodibility and need to have that's interesting, and that's kind of why, like, one of the thoughts that I first had not to include the Sri Lanka or Guyana Shield data on this initial data set. I haven't thought about doing more studies in that with that respect, but I think that climate does play a factor in that respect. Yes. And I think it's interesting. I think it would be adding or magnifying that effect of erodibility in some of these landscapes, and this can happen also in places like the Appalachian Mountains. Yeah, but I like your comment. Thank you. Any special order? Maybe that way.
I'm curious.
Yeah. This. Thank you for your question. So that I just created to explain, to have like a hypothetical scenario. So what we can do is that there are already community available or open source models that you can play with. One of which is called LandLab, but there's others where you can simulate a landscape and create a mountain range. So every grid, every pixel has an elevation, and basically you solve an equation through time, and then you run a landscape. You can impose a certain uplift. So all this landscape is like a tray that is getting uplifted at the same rate, and then you can put climate, or you can change erodibility either spatially or through time. And then see the results. And then so create, like, this is just elevation, but then you can create the rivers, measure the steepness at all these points, and then measure the erosion rate from your model, like how much erosion occurred from one time step to the other for all those points that you can see there, all these little points. And so we ran two models. This is done by my collaborator, but we ran two models. So we basically created a fake landscape. We run it for several tens of millions of years, and then we stop rock uplift. So we are not worried about the rock uplift variable. It's going to start eroding and uplifting just isostatically. So every time you erode 1 kilometer, you get 800 meters of isostatic uplift on kind of simple back of the envelope calculation. So it's just a landscape that is eroding, uplifting, eroding, uplifting, eroding, uplifting. And then over time, we can see how this erosion rate versus basin steepness for all those points changes. And we had two models that we ran. One where the erodability, so we said like this, all the pixels have the same rock type. And then the other one, the erodability will change with time. Rocks will get stronger with time. So literally that K variable, and this is time. We change it with time. So the rocks here are stronger. They're harder to erode over time. And then we measured for at 3 different time steps for all these points. So we measure when the orogen was young, then intermediate, and then old after 100 million years. And this is the data that you get. So if you use the same strength, the young orogen is steep and high, and the erosion rates are high, so you're here. The intermediate orogen is here, and then the older orogen is here. The landscape starts getting more subdued. The steepness is not as high, right? Like your slopes are gonna get lower over time. The relief is getting smaller. And if you play around changing the erodability over time, you don't get that single relationship, but you're kind of getting a little bit less steep over time, but also you get these jumps in erosion rate over time. So for the same steepness, your erosion rate is very different over time. Your older orogen that has the stronger rocks, the erodibility is lower, has the property that at the same erosion rate, at the same steepness of the landscape, it erodes much slower. So that's what we did to get those. The synthetic data was just to explain the hypothesis, but we did this modeling, and you can play around with these models of having constant versus variable erodability over time. But this is purely hypothetical. Yeah. Yes. The data that I'm showing is from catchment averages. Yeah, I know that. Yeah, there is some like compilations and comparisons of catchment wide versus outcrop data. There is a paper in 2011, and I think it showed like slightly higher values for the catchments, and I'm sure that from some of these catchments you would find also outcrop data. I'm not sure right now, apart from getting a lot more variability, like what trend you would see. But I don't know if you have an idea of like where this could take, or. Yes. No, yeah, that's really good ideas, and I think that my hope in the future is to go onto a much finer scale. Yeah, this is broad. This is like a very broad hypothetical ideas, but people have already shown at a more local scale that you can refine this type of study in a smaller scale. So I think that's a good idea. Yeah, like teaming up with people that do this outcrop work, that measure fractures and things like that. Yeah, thank you.
Very good talk.
So it could be this one or this one.
Colorado plateau. Appalachian plateau. They're kind of using fracture depth, but wait. Logic.
So I agree with what you said. The same part. I have also wondered if that's why we see the Colorado and the Appalachian Plateau a little bit higher. I think that's, yeah, it's pretty interesting, and people have definitely shown on the same mountain range that different rock types can give you that scatter. Like yeah, you can not only like if you look at lithology, which is not exactly what we're plotting here, it does. And I'm going to show you an example here in the Wasatch Range that the same, in a similar place with different lithologies, you can get that vertical separation also. I think that I have thought about that, maybe also using maybe seismic data to get at some sort of fracture of the or state of the crust. You could probably also, yeah, use remote sensing and you look at lineaments or yeah, or actually measure it and just go to 2 of these sites or 3 of these sites and get some actual data. Yes, yeah, I want to do that. I think that I've just not had the time to develop those ideas that much, but I think that those are, it's good to hear it from the audience, and that gives me more ideas to do. Yeah, I think that you could do that. Like if I had more money and students now, I think I would like to go and do more smaller scale work, comparing either these 2 areas or comparing those 2 areas, because I agree that there are other confounding factors here that we're not taking into account. And what you're pointing out is that in the Appalachians, I kind of put it in the, because we have both, right? We have sedimentary rocks and we have basement that we're plotting. So maybe it's not the same. Yeah, maybe it's not it's not necessarily the same process that is acting on those two orogens in the Appalachians. In one you clearly have a sedimentary cover, and in other you have a basement exposed. And yeah, I had a plot over here for this is just the Wasatch Mountains. So part of the scatter that we find even in each province is because you have different rock types within one single province, right? So if you look at the Basin and Range or the Colorado Plateau, just within that province, you're gonna find, this is steepness, a metric of steepness and erosion rate here. Just within this province here in the Wasatch Range, you have different rock types that give you scatter. However, when we plot all of them, we still find that each orogen kind of behaves or has its own regression. But yeah, we have a lot of scatter even within each province. And yeah, but thank you for your question.
So how we structure and how we, what are the implications of how we approach those
Yeah, so I would say like this is not like an exact study that can be applied directly to like save or protect a specific city, but it is pointing at the fact that when, for example, when you use a landslide model and you're maybe assessing the risk of landslides in an area, you might, people consider fracture densities and consider rock types, but maybe that this is highlighting that that's pretty important, like the actual state of the rocks, and maybe studying that in a more profound way, like not assuming that all granite behaves the same way, but granite that is highly fractured or where the fracture densities are really, really thinly spaced will behave differently than granitic rock like Yosemite or something like that. So I think this is kind of highlighting the importance of erodibility when we study rocks and when we study erosion processes. So I think that this will just, it gives strength to that idea. And if you're making any type of study, pay attention to the rocks. Don't just call everything soil, or don't just call everything one type of rock. Go closer to the rocks, look at their structure, the fracture density, the minerals, how much weathering has occurred in rocks. I think this is an exciting moment, I think, for geomorphology to focus more on the rock types. When I was on undergrad, in a wrong way, like I tried not to look at erodibility. For some reason, it didn't catch my attention, and I was more focused on the steepness of the mountains and these tectonically active landscapes of Colombia. But now I am going to the same mountain range and looking at two rock types and how they can shape the shape of the mountains is going to be different just because they have different rock types. Or if we have, for example, a coastal mountain range in Colombia that receives the same type of wave erosion, but just the rock type creates totally different topography. So I don't know. I think it's an exciting moment to focus on rock types, which is something that a lot of people have focused for a long time, but I didn't. So yeah. So I would say like look at the rocks and look at the erodibility of rocks. So I think that's kind of
Thank you once again.